Good evening and welcome to a New Look Scotland tonight. At the start of the first full week of general election campaigning, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, addressed the STUC annual Congress. Turning her fire on the Conservatives, she claimed that hardliners had taken over the party and now want to take over the country. After her speech, the SNP leader joined us in the studio. First Minister, you've been talking up the Conservatives, and perhaps no surprise, Professor John Curtis was talking about the polls at the weekend, and if these polls pan out as they appear to, then that suggests the Conservatives might win up to 12 seats. That must be a concern.
Well, I mean, it's a cliche, but the only poll that matters for any party is the one on polling day, obviously. But the point I'm making is a very clear point. There is no cost-free tactical Tory vote in this election. If people vote Tory, then what they are doing is what the Prime Minister has asked them to do, which is to strengthen her hand. And of course, strengthening the hand of a Tory government has big implications for Scotland and for the UK as a whole. It will mean more austerity, deeper cuts, the voice of the Scottish Parliament being steamrollered. So my message in this election is if you don't want the Tories to be strengthened and emboldened, if you instead want to have a strong opposition and Scotland's voice being heard loudly and clearly, then the only way to secure that is to vote SNP.
The truth is this is an election you could have done without, though.
Well, it's an election that, we will relish the prospect of because, I'm a politician. Politicians tend to enjoy elections. But I do think it's really important to reflect on why the Prime Minister has called this election. I don't think she did it for the good of the country. I think she did it in the narrow interests of the Conservative Party. Firstly, she's looked at the travails of the Labour Party, the complete meltdown of the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, and seen an opportunity, an excuse to try to strengthen her grip. You can understand why she's seen that opportunity, because the only, in Scotland, certainly the only party rising in the polls, a popular leader. Well, look, this is a Prime Minister, though, that just weeks before was saying that the last thing the country needed was a general election. She changed her mind, U-turned, and for narrow party interest decided to hold a general election. But I think the other point is one that's perhaps been slightly missed. The Crown Prosecution Service in England has said that it is investigating perhaps up to 30 Conservative MPs for alleged election expenses fraud in the last election. So perhaps she's looked at her slender majority, the prospect of a large number of by-elections, and decided to go quickly. But
you think that's the reason she's gone for this election?
I'm speculating, but certainly that is a live possibility. Now,
okay.
The point I'm making is I don't think the election was called in the interests of the country, but instead in the interests of the Conservative Party. But either way, we're having the election, and I'm relishing the prospect of contesting it.
The Prime Minister has said she could have an easier hand working on Europe and the negotiations over the EU. Now, for decades, it's been the commitment of the SNP that an independent Scotland would be a full member of the EU. Will that policy still be in your manifesto of this election?
I want Scotland to be in the European Union. I want the UK to be in the European Union. Yes, I want us to be a full member of the European Union. That's always been my position, not because I think the EU is perfect, but because I think it's in Scotland's interest to be in there, particularly in the European single market. So that's the position I've argued. I've got to recognise where we are. The Tories are intending to take us out of Europe against our will, and of course we have to consider the implications of that. But I have argued and continue to argue that, on balance, more than on balance, it's better for Scotland to be in the European Union, arguing for change within it.
So that will be in your manifesto?
So that's my position, and I'll set out with the greatest of respect. If I start to tell you one thing about my manifesto, then you'll ask me all sorts of other questions. Parties set out their manifestos in elections, but I'm not trying to hide anything from you here. My position on the European Union is clear. But what I've said is that we have to recognise where we are. It may be that the Tories the Tories want to take us out of the European Union. Clearly, I then, in this election, is not deciding whether or not Scotland's independent, but in a future debate about that, I would have to set out the process for re-securing our relationship with Europe. But my position on the European Union is crystal clear, unlike the Tories, incidentally, who argued for us staying in and have abandoned that position.
But you do have an issue, because a third of SNP voters voted to remain voted to leave the EU. So you're offering a post-independence referendum, Indir F2, as people are saying, on the basis of full membership of the EU. Is that perhaps the wrong thing to be tying your campaign to?
Look, as a politician, I try to argue what I believe is right, and I try to argue that case and persuade people of the case that I believe is right for the country. But, let's sort of roll back a little bit. We're about in a few weeks' time to contest a general election called by the Tories who thought it wasn't the right time to have a vote and distract themselves from their day job, but we're having that election. Now, this election will not decide whether or not Scotland becomes independent, nor is it necessary to get a mandate for a referendum, because we sought and won that mandate in the Scottish elections last year. This election is about whether people want to see an unfettered, out-of-control Tory government doing its worst to Scotland, or whether they want strong voices and a real opposition to the Tories. That's what this election is about.
But it is about Europe, and if you have a third of your members who appear to want to leave the EU, that does give you an issue. I don't have a third of my members who want to leave the EU.
Me,
a third of your voters appear to want to leave the EU. That creates a problem for you.
Well, look, I will argue the case that I think is right for the country, and I'll do that on whatever issue. I think in politics, I think leaders have a responsibility to lead and to set out what they think is the right position. Of course, it's up to the voters to determine whether or not they agree with that. But I'm focusing right now, well, firstly on a local government election just a few days from now, and then on a general election. And so it's not going to settle the issue of whether or not Scotland becomes independent in the European Union in future. But what it will do is determine whether there are strong voices trying to stop the Prime Minister taking the UK to the hardest possible Brexit and standing up against austerity and for public services.
Something you may be able to offer people then, is this something you might consider post the election, would be if there was to be post the general election and independence referendum, would you perhaps offer a referendum?
You're now getting several contexts.
I am, but I'm just trying to say so people know where they might go and how some people might support you in this election who maybe want to leave the EU. Would you offer a referendum on an EU for independence?
That's not
Scotland,
the position of the SNP, but we are sort of getting ahead of ourselves here. I'm focused on a local government election in 10 days' time and a general election on June the 8th. And these elections are all about public services and about standing up with strong voices to protect Scotland from the Conservatives. So let me, with the greatest respect, let me focus on the elections to come, and then no doubt we'll have these discussions.
You're talking about stronger voice for Scotland. You have called for a second independence referendum. Downing Street has said no. The Scottish Parliament has called for a second independence referendum. Downing Street has said no. So what can you do now?
Well, look, I'm focusing on an election right now. I've said I'll set out the next steps on that. I was intending to do that after the local government elections. We've now got a general election, so I'm going to fight that election. But at the heart of this general election is a question about what kind of country do we want Scotland to be and who gets the right to choose. Now, that's a bigger question than just Europe or just independence. It's about our economy. It's about
you're talking about strong voice for Scotland, and I'm asking how
first
strong
and foremost,
is that voice?
Whether it's on respecting the voice of the Scottish Parliament, or whether it's about standing up against further cuts and for our public services, whether it's about standing against the hardest possible Brexit, then on June the 8th in the general election, Scotland has a choice. Does it allow an unfettered Tory government to do its worst regardless of the implications, or does it? Well, first and foremost, people can vote SNP on June the 8th.
What difference will that make? The 56 SNP MPs went to Westminster last time. What difference have they made?
Well, they've been, I think, by common consent, the only effective opposition to the Tories.
Okay, but what have they done? What have they changed?
You see Angus Robertson each and every week providing the real challenge to the Prime Minister. We saw at the budget, for example, Jeremy Corbyn completely missing the net, and Stuart Hosey, our Treasury spokesperson, being the one that challenged the budget, leading to a Tory U-turn on national insurance. Was that not driven by backbenchers, though? That wasn't driven by the SNP. Well, it was the SNP that led the opposition charge on that, and a whole range of different things. The rate clause, for example, it's my colleague who shares my constituency, Alison Fulis, who's been leading the charge against the appalling rate clause. Now,
but if there hadn't been,
well, I don't accept that. I think it's been the voice of the SNP that's meant that the Tories haven't had a complete free hand. If it had been left to Labour, Labour capitulated on Brexit, they capitulated on a hard Brexit, there's been no coherent opposition to austerity. Now, the choice for Scotland is, do we just allow the Tories to do whatever they want, or do we make sure there are those strong voices?
You're talking
and I
about
think
voices,
we should have those strong voices.
But little has actually changed, and this is a Conservative government with a slim majority. If your predictions are correct, then they may have a far bigger majority where your voice might even be weaker.
Which is all the more important, that we have strong voices there backing up the Scottish Parliament, Parliament, making sure that the voice of the Scottish Parliament can't be ignored, because the only alternative to that is just to accept that the Tories get to do whatever they will. We know that Labour have been a shambles, and if Labour lose this election and by a magnitude that some people predict, then Labour are going to have probably a bloodbath. We need strong voices and a strong opposition, people holding a Conservative government to account, and only the SNP, from a Scottish point of view, can do that. When
the general election was called, STV News did various vox pops with people, and there was clearly a tone there that people, not again, famously Brenda, and we had one person talking about scudder to the back teeth. Now, you mentioned earlier on, you're a professional politician, campaigning is what you enjoy, but are you concerned that maybe people will just not engage?
Well, I didn't choose to have this general election. It was the Prime Minister's choice, but, we are where we are. Now, in any election, the responsibility of politicians is to inspire people to want to vote, to set out a programme and a manifesto and a set of policies that people want to vote for. Now, that's the responsibility I've got on behalf of the SNP, and I look forward to doing that. But, not voting, of course, gives the Tories exactly what they want. So, people in Scotland have to get out there to make sure that in this election, may not have been an election we chose to have, but in this election, Scotland's voice is heard, and it's heard loudly and very strongly.
First Minister, thanks for joining us on the New Look Scotland tonight.
Thank you.
Well, all the four main Scottish party leaders were on the campaign trail today. Here's some of what they had to say.
Well, I think the issue we have in Abbeymoor with Nicola Sturgeon and Jeremy Corbyn fighting over the unions is that they agree on so much. Nicola Sturgeon wants to use this election campaign to push a second independence referendum, and the last time Jeremy Corbyn came to Scotland, he said he'd be absolutely fine with that. So people across Scotland know if you want to stand up to the SNP, stand against a second independence referendum, the Scottish Conservatives is the only place to cast your vote.
This general election is a clear choice between two nationalistic parties which will tear the UK apart, or a Labour Party which will put the people first. Nicola Sturgeon is only interested in one thing: to break our relationship with the rest of the United Kingdom. And having a Tory government in Westminster is what she wants, so that she can continue her grievance and gripes all the way.
This is an opportunity to change the direction of the country. So if you believe that Scotland should be in the heart of the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom should be in the heart of the European Union, then there is no other choice than to back the Liberal Democrats.
Well, to Dundee now, and the political editor of the Daily Record, David Clegg. David, thanks for joining us. What did you make of the First Minister's interview with Scotland tonight?
I think the most striking thing was what a difference 2 years make. If you just think back to the last general election in 2015, all the SNP messages were about taking votes off the Labour Party. They were trying to vanquish the Labour Party in Scotland, and they pretty much did it successfully. This time round, it's the Tories who are in their sights. They've been spooked by these opinion polls which suggest there could be a Tory surge, that the constitutional question has helped revive the Tories, and they're trying to say to people who were maybe unionists, maybe not too keen on a second independence referendum, but beware of the Tories, beware of what you wish for. If you vote for a protest vote for the Tories because of constitutional reasons, we'll get you welfare cuts, we'll get you a Tory government unfettered, will be a big problem for Scotland. So whether that message strikes home now is the question, and I think the SNP clearly think they've pretty much got all the 40 or so seats they won off the Labour Party in the bag, and it's just the ones they tussle with the Tories for they've got to worry about.
The UK Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, of course, speaking at the STUC Congress in Abbeymoor as well today. What did you make of his speech?
It went down very well in the room. It was a speech that was very much about trade unions. It was a message that trade unionists would very much welcome. I think the problem is whether it went outside the room, whether it spoke to the rest of the country. And part of the problem in doing that is that he spent the day hiding from the media. He didn't speak to any newspapers. He didn't give any TV interviews. So he's very comfortable talking in a hall with trade unionists where he spent a large proportion of his life. I don't think he's so comfortable talking to the public, and that could be the problem.
The polls over the weekend showing the Tories are buoyant. What would you read into them?
I think we should have a note of caution about that. Some of these polls have suggested the Tories could be winning as many as 12 seats in Scotland. I think that's pretty outlandish, to be honest. We've heard of proposed Tory revivals at every election for a long time, but it does seem that the Tories finally, because of the way Scottish politics has been reframed around the independence question, have a message which is resonating with a significant percentage of the populace. So we've seen Tory posters, we said no, we meant it. I think it's quite clear from polling that there is a substantial number of people in Scotland who are fed up with debating the Constitution, that don't want a second independence referendum, and a great deal of them seem prepared to vote Tory if they think that that's the best way to stop it from happening.
So what do you think will be the dominant issue in the general election campaign here in Scotland?
Obviously, it will be independence. Funnily enough, as Nicola Sturgeon's interview made clear there, independence is not something that she's particularly wanting to talk about during this general election campaign. She's trying very much to decouple an SNP vote in this general election with independence. I think she'll struggle to do that because of the general tenor of the earlier in the year where she was pushing for another referendum. The question then is, how does Brexit play into all this? Because in the rest of the UK, in England and Wales, Brexit is going to be the question. So how does Scotland respond to the Brexit debate being mapped on top of the independence question?
David, thanks for joining us in Scotland tonight.
Thank you.
Now, from one election battle to another, the first round of the French presidential election saw two outsiders take